This foreign pilot stole the identity of an American pilot. He lied to the FAA and he evaded authorities conducting illegal flights for several years before he was finally discovered after he crashed in a cornfield less than a mile from the runway. However, there's a lot more to this crazy story, including why this illegal flight would not be his last. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Before we talk about what happened during the flight, we need to rewind a little bit. Our story begins in 1992 when this man was just 18 years old. He was an Iranian citizen, but he entered the United States on a student visa. I'm not sure how to pronounce his full name, so I'll just call him Nadir, and I just so happened to find a Facebook profile belonging to Nadir Captain that features his image. According to the Facebook account, Nadir Captain claims to have attended school at MIT and Stanford, but there are no records to support this. And as you're going to learn, you probably shouldn't believe anything he says. What we know for certain is that he overstayed his student visa, and in the late 1990s, he was arrested in Arizona for various theft and fraud schemes involving aircraft. According to at least one source, he was then deported to Mexico, where he got married and started a business down there. Somehow, Nadir made his way back to the United States because he was able to obtain a private pilot certificate from the FAA on August 28, 2001. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any records regarding where he did his flight training, and his name wouldn't pop up again until 3 years later in 2004. At that time, Nadir was the pilot flying a private jet from Venezuela to the United States, and he made a short stop for fuel in southern Mexico. During a routine inspection at the airport, he was arrested for human trafficking when authorities discovered 3 Mexican and 5 Asian passengers on board without any documentation. Nadir's co-pilot offered the authorities $5,000 to look the other way, but that didn't work out and they were all arrested. Despite Nadir's trouble with the law, he somehow made his way back into the United States, where he would end up using over a dozen different aliases, and he even claimed to have spent some time working at Lockheed Martin. Now, the timing of the next series of events isn't very clear, but Nadir's name eventually would turn up again during a congressional hearing regarding Homeland Security. During that testimony, they talked about how long before the plane crash, Nadir had spent years duping the FAA. By 2008, he had racked up a significant criminal record that included stealing an aircraft, he had his pilot's license revoked, and he was deported from the United States in 2006. If you're keeping track, that would be the second time that he was deported from the US. Now, at some point, either before or after he was deported, Daniel George enters the story. Daniel was a US citizen, but he was also a pilot with an airline transport pilot certificate. Daniel needed some help, so he hired Nadir to fly a plane for him, and that would be the start of Daniel's worst nightmare. Thanks to the information he gathered during their business together, Nadir was able to use all of Daniel's personal information to go online and request for the FAA to send him a copy of Daniel's pilot license. The only problem was Nadir forgot to change the email address on the account. So when Daniel got an email notification about the new license, he called the FAA and they stopped the certificate before it was mailed out. Normally, that might be the end of the story, and you'd think that maybe the FAA would put a fraud alert or something like that on Daniel's account, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. When Nadir didn't get the license, he just picked up the phone and called the FAA, pretending to be Daniel, saying that he was very upset that he never got his license in the mail. And without asking any further questions, the FAA sent Nadir the new license with Daniel's name on it. The truth is that because FAA pilot license don't include photographs of the pilot, this allowed Nadir to pretend to be Daniel, so that way he could work as a commercial pilot for several years before one day authorities discovered Daniel's license in a plane crash in this cornfield. Now that you understand a little bit more about Nadir's background, we need to talk about what happened during the flight, the court trial that followed, and where Nadir is today. On September 15, 2012, Nadir and a friend were going to take a short flight from the Strasbourg airport in Germany to the Bornholm airport in Denmark. Nadir filed a flight plan and stated they had 90 minutes of fuel available for the 30-minute flight. The aircraft they were flying was a Learjet 24D. This aircraft requires 2 pilots to operate, and Danish TV outlets claimed that the passenger had a valid pilot certificate. However, according to the Danish Accident Investigation Board, he didn't. Either way, not much else is known about the passenger on this flight other than that he refused to talk about what happened. The most important thing you need to know about this aircraft is that its registration was revoked 7 months prior to this accident, and its last valid airworthiness certificate expired in 2005, about 7 years before the crash. Basically, there was no reason this airplane should have been flying, and the accident board said that it was thought-provoking that a non-registered aircraft was accepted by a regulated aviation system 12 times in 2012, and they felt this warranted further consideration by the European Aviation Safety Authority. No one knows for sure where Nadir got the aircraft from, but according to one news outlet, Nadir had used cash to purchase a Learjet that he found in a storage hangar in an aviation museum in Switzerland prior to this accident. It's not clear if this was the same Learjet or not. Either way, the aircraft never should have been flying. Additionally, there was no evidence that Nadir ever accomplished any formal training to fly a Learjet. He didn't have a logbook, and he couldn't produce any evidence of having a valid pilot certificate from any country. Essentially, you have someone who isn't qualified to be a pilot charging passengers to fly on an aircraft that isn't airworthy, and no one knew he was doing it. And that was just shocking to me how he was able to convince people to pay him money for these flights and he was getting away with it. Fortunately, the only passenger on the accident flight was Nadir's friend, who didn't pay for the experience. On the day of the accident, they departed Germany late in the morning, and there were some clouds around 5,000 feet, but visual meteorological conditions were forecast for both airfields. Most of the flight was uneventful until they got about 18 nautical miles from the field. That's when Nadir canceled his IFR clearance and continued under visual flight rules, planning to fly a visual approach to runway 29. Everything seemed to be normal, and as he descended, the airspeed began increasing, and as he was turning final for runway 29, he was cleared to land. About 2 minutes later, when the aircraft was on short final, both engines failed, and Nadir declared an emergency. The airspeed rapidly decreased until the aircraft stalled a few seconds later, and they crashed in a cornfield about 1 kilometer short of the runway. At the time of the crash, no one in Europe knew anything about who Nadir was, and the authorities in America hadn't seen him since they deported him 6 years ago. Surprisingly, thanks to the slow speed of the aircraft and the cornfield absorbing some of the impact, Nadir and his passenger were able to survive the crash. After they pulled him from the wreckage, he told authorities that he was a 37-year-old Mexican citizen named Ruiz Leonardo, which just so happened to match one of the passports he had. However, Ruiz didn't have a pilot certificate, but authorities discovered 2 other FAA pilot certificates in the wreckage. One of them belonged to Daniel George, and the other had the same certificate number on it, but a completely different name belonging to another identity. That's why one of the biggest challenges for this investigation was trying to figure out who this guy was. Nadir had used so many aliases over the years and traveled the world fleeing authorities for so long that there were multiple agencies involved in the investigation. As far as they could tell, Nadir never worked for anyone other than himself, and all of his fraudulent activities were simply an effort to make some money as a pilot so he could keep flying. They never found any ties to terrorism or drugs with any of his flights. Despite the questionable airworthiness of the aircraft, there was nothing mechanically wrong with it that would have caused the crash. The investigators discovered 160 liters of fuel remaining in the fuselage. And even though this wasn't enough for adequate reserves for the flight, it would have been enough for the aircraft to make it 1 or 2 more kilometers to the runway, but Nadir didn't know what he was doing. That's because the fuel system on this aircraft requires the pilot to actively monitor and transfer fuel from the fuselage to the wing tanks, because the wing tanks are what feed the engines. In fact, the approach checklist tells you to check the fuel balance. Nadir apparently never did that, because the wreckage revealed that the fuel transfer valve and the cross-flow valves were in the closed position, and that was consistent with the position of the fuselage tank transfer switch being in the off position. If Nadir had just transferred the fuel correctly, he probably would have landed safely, and he would have continued fooling everyone until something worse happened. Unfortunately, this illegal flight wouldn't be his last, as Nadir captain still had a few more tricks up his sleeve. Nadir stood trial in Denmark and was sentenced to 10 months in prison for endangering passengers and flying without a valid license, but that's not the end of his story. After serving his time, he was transferred to Berlin, where he went to court again because he owned a German company where he sold aircraft parts but never delivered them to buyers. Germany gave him a suspended sentence for 1 year and 10 months, but soon thereafter he disappeared. Nadir must have been desperate to fly again because in February 2014, he reached out to the FAA so he could get another medical certificate to apply for a job as a pilot. On his application with the FAA, he changed one letter in the spelling of his name, and he changed his birth year from 1972 to 1973. That was all that was needed to fool the FAA, and they issued him a new certificate that he immediately used to get a new job with an Indonesian airline. However, he wasn't there very long because the company discovered his passport number belonged to someone else, so they alerted the United States and Nadir fled to Brazil. Eventually, he showed up in Panama, and that's when he was arrested and extradited to America, where Daniel George was perhaps finally going to see justice. In November 2014, Nadir pleaded guilty to 4 counts of identity theft, and he was sentenced to 27 months. He was released from prison in October 2016 and deported to Iran, his 3rd time being deported from the US. But as I said at the beginning, this illegal flight that he crashed on would not be his last. It's not clear when Nadir started flying again, but in October 2018, he was arrested in Paraguay for flying with a fake pilot license, and he was handed over to DEA agents who took Nadir and his plane back to the US. Now, I couldn't find out what happened after that, but apparently he didn't stay in prison very long because if this is his Facebook profile, then it's possible he's living in Brazil and he might be looking to purchase an A320 to restore and maybe open some bank accounts in the Seychelles and Cape Verde. My guess is Nadir is going to keep flying until he gets caught again. Perhaps he'll find another way to make it back into the United States and find someone else to take advantage of, so consider this a warning to be very careful about who you hire. If you want to see another crazy story involving 2 foreign pilots that were harassing boats in America and what happened to them, then click on this video on the screen to find out more, and thank you for your support.